In 2003, in a cemetery buried deep in the Taklamakan desert of western China, archaeologists opened a coffin shaped like a boat and found a woman who had been lying there for 3,600 years. She wore a felt hat and a woolen coat and boots lined with fur, and her face was intact. Laid along her throat, arranged carefully, like a necklace, were small pale lumps of something nobody could identify. They would stay unidentified for 21 years. In 2021, her DNA appeared to settle an argument that had run for a century. Between 2022 and 2026, 4 more studies reopened it, and one of them was led by the same scientist who thought she had closed it. The answer was stranger than the isolation everyone had accepted, and it was still around her neck. The cemetery is called Xiaohe, Small River Cemetery number 5, sitting in open dune country in the Taklamakan, the desert that fills the center of the Tarim Basin in western China. Systematic excavation there began in the early 2000s, and what came out of the sand was one of the strangest burial grounds ever recorded. The dead had been laid inside hollowed wooden coffins shaped like boats and sealed with cattle hide. Above them stood a forest of tall wooden posts, some of them carved, driven upright into the dune. Hundreds of individuals were buried there, generation after generation, in a place that offers nothing a human being needs. Nothing about that landscape suggests preservation, and yet it has preserved its dead better than almost anywhere on Earth. The reason is not embalming, it is chemistry. The air is brutally dry and the soil is heavy with salt, and together they pulled the water out of bodies laid in the ground until the flesh desiccated in place. These are not mummies in the Egyptian sense. Nobody prepared them, nobody removed their organs or wrapped them or painted their coffins with spells. The desert did the work by accident, drawing out the moisture so completely that eyelashes survived, and skin lines survived, and the fine hair on a forearm survived across thousands of years. Wool survived, felt survived. The weave of a coat survived tight enough to count the threads. The people buried at Xiaohe are among the earliest human remains ever recovered from the region. The individuals whose genomes would later be read date to roughly 2,100 to 1,700 years before the Common Era. Across the wider basin, burials in these cemeteries continue for close to 2 millennia after that, down to around 200 years into the Common Era. This was not a single moment. It was a practice, held in one place, across a span longer than most civilizations have managed. And on some of these bodies, the excavators found something they could not name. Small pale lumps, scattered around the head and the neck, sitting directly on the skin. On the woman in tomb 25, they had been laid along her throat in a line. The substance was dry and dense and hard. It was clearly organic and clearly placed, and beyond that, nobody could say. Protein analysis carried out in the years that followed narrowed it. The material appeared to be a fermented dairy product of some kind. But which kind? Made how? From the milk of what animal? And why it had been put on a corpse at all? The proteins could not answer. The question stayed open for 2 decades. Because the substance was not the only thing about these bodies that refused to resolve. When the dead came out of the sand, they did not carry the features anyone expected to find in the deep interior of Asia. They were often tall, their eye sockets were deep set, their noses were high and narrow, their hair ran from flaxen to a dark rust red, preserved strand by the dry salt ground. To the researchers standing over them, these looked like people who belonged thousands of kilometers to the west. It is worth being precise about what that observation was and what it was not. It was a first impression. It was skeletal measurement and visible tissue, read by people looking for a category, and the category available was geographic. Physical features are not a passport. They do not record where a person came from, and the history of trying to read ancestry off a face is not a good one. What the observation actually established was narrower than it sounded. These people did not look like the populations living in that region today, and they did not look like the populations the written record says came later. They were living in the Tarim Basin more than 1,000 years before the Silk Road opened the corridor to long-distance trade. They predated almost everyone the written record accounts for, and they looked to the eyes examining them like they had no business being there at all. Every serious theory started from the same assumption. These people came from somewhere else. The only real disagreement was the route. One explanation pointed north to the Afanasyevo, a Bronze Age herding culture of the steppe country around the Altai Mountains. In this version, the founders of the Tarim were steppe migrants who pushed south into the basin, bringing their animals and their burial customs with them. It was a clean story. Herders move, and everything they carry moves with them. A second explanation looked southwest to the oasis civilization known as the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex, a network of irrigated settlements in Central Asia with monumental architecture and sophisticated craft. In this reading, the Tarim founders came out of those oases carrying farming and metalwork east into the sand. A third pointed to the inner Asian mountain corridor, the chain of high valleys and summer pastures that could have funneled populations down into the basin from the north and west along the grass. 3 theories, 3 different maps. Every one of them drew an arrow pointing inward, toward the Tarim, from outside. The scholar who did the most to carry these bodies to an audience beyond China was Victor Mayer, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, who encountered them and could not let the question go. And the question was the obvious one. How did people who looked like this end up in a place like this? And where on earth had they come from? The material culture seemed to argue for the West as loudly as the faces did. These were not people dressed in hides scraped together for survival. They were dressed in woven wool, some of it patterned with twill and checks that reminded observers of textiles produced far away in Central Europe. There were felt hats, carefully shaped, some of them tall and pointed. Cloth like that requires looms, and looms require tradition, and nothing in the surrounding landscape explained where the tradition had come from. It is worth noting what that argument actually rests on. Similar cloth does not mean shared ancestry. Techniques travel. They have always traveled faster and further than the people who invented them. But in the absence of anything better, resemblance was the evidence available, and resemblance pointed outward. The genetic work available at the time only muddied things. Samples reportedly taken out of the country in the early 1990s were said to show links to European ancestry. A team led by Li Jin at Fudan University later reported a more mixed picture, one that included East Asian markers among the remains. That finding was contested. Mayer and others disputed it. The overall picture stayed unsettled, a set of partial results pointing in different directions and resolving into nothing. What made the science harder was that the mummies had become political. To many Uyghur communities in the region, these ancient bodies were ancestors, and their presence was taken as evidence of a claim to the land that ran deeper than later arrivals. The Chinese state grew wary of exactly that argument. Access to the remains tightened. Foreign researchers found it increasingly difficult to study the bodies directly, and the archaeology became entangled with a dispute over who belonged in the region and for how long. None of that is a matter this account can settle, and it is worth stating plainly that the archaeology and the modern politics are separate questions that became very difficult to keep apart. So that was the state of play as the 21st century opened. A world-famous mystery, a set of striking bodies with unexpected faces in a Chinese desert. Several competing homelands, each proposing a different journey, each of them assuming that a journey had happened at all. And underneath it, a set of remains that almost nobody outside China was permitted to test with the tools that might have decided the matter. The question had been argued for 100 years without resolution because the argument was being conducted over the wrong evidence. Faces, cloth, hats, resemblance. Nobody had read the one record that could not be argued into a homeland it did not have. Nobody had read their genomes. That changed in October of 2021 in the journal Nature, in a paper titled The Genomic Origins of the Bronze Age Tarim Basin Mummies. It was led by a researcher named Fan Zhang, working with an international team that included Christina Warrener, a molecular archaeologist affiliated with Harvard and the Max Planck Institute, along with Chungguan Zhang, Yinqiu Kui, and Johannes Kraus. The scope was careful, and it matters later, so it is worth stating precisely. The team recovered genome-wide data for 18 individuals out of 33 attempted. 13 of those came from the Tarim Basin, dating to roughly 2,100 to 1,700 years before the Common Era. 5 came from the Dzungarian Basin, north of the Tian Shan Mountains, dating earlier to around 3,000 to 2,800. These were not stragglers. They were among the oldest people either region had produced. The logic going in was simple, and Zhang laid it out plainly. Where there is migration, there are genes. If these people had come from the west, from the Afanasyevo steppe, from the Central Asian oases, from anywhere at all, that homeland would have left a signature written into their DNA. Find the signature and you find the road. All the team had to do was read it. What they found was that the road did not exist. There was no detectable Western steppe ancestry in the Tarim individuals, no Afanasyevo signal. None of the genetic fingerprints that a migration from the west or the north would have stamped into them. The theories had spent decades arguing over which journey these people had made, and the genomes came back fitting none of them. The Tarim founders had not arrived from anywhere. Their ancestry was entirely local, descended from populations that had already been in and around the region for thousands of years before the graves were dug. The composition was striking. Roughly 72% of their ancestry traced to a lineage geneticists call the ancient North Eurasians, with the remaining portion, about 28%, coming from an ancient Northeast Asian source. And the contrast made it sharper. The 5 individuals from Dzungaria, north of the mountains, were predominantly Afanasyevo, same broad region, overlapping era. Completely different answer. The steppe migration everyone had been looking for was real, and it was documented, and it had stopped short. The ancient North Eurasians themselves were the harder part of the answer. They were hunter-gatherers of the Siberian interior during the last ice age, and after the glaciers retreated, they faded from the record almost everywhere. For a long time, nobody knew they had existed. They were a gap, a shape other populations seemed to require, but that had never been seen directly. Then a body gave them a face. Near Lake Baikal, at a site called Malta, lay the remains of a child who died roughly 24,000 years ago. A team led by Eski Willerslev sequenced his genome and confirmed the population that science had only inferred. Estimates of how much ancient North Eurasian ancestry survives in living people vary considerably by study and by method, and the honest position is that it is a substantial share in some populations and a disputed figure in others. What is not disputed is that the source itself vanished, surviving mostly as fragments inside others. The Tarim founders turned out to be among the best surviving representatives of that lineage anywhere on Earth. The study found one more thing. Milk proteins preserved in the hardened plaque on their teeth showed they were dairy pastoralists from the founding of the site. Their diet braided the continent together. Wheat from the west, millet from the east, dairy herding on top of it. Warrener put the paradox directly: genetically isolated, culturally cosmopolitan. They borrowed from every direction the compass offered and married none of the people who brought it. For 4 years, that was the answer. A sealed genetic island sitting in the middle of a landscape full of traffic. Case closed, in the most satisfying way a century-old argument can close. And then somebody finally looked at what was around her neck. In September of 2024, in the journal Cell, A team led by Yichen Liu and Xiaohe Fu at the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology in Beijing published the answer. They had worked with Wenying Li of the Xinjiang Institute of Cultural Relics and Archaeology and with Yimin Yang, and they had done something nobody had managed in the 2 decades since the lumps came out of the sand. They had extracted DNA from the substance itself. It was cheese. Specifically, it was kefir, a fermented dairy product made by inoculating milk with a starter culture of bacteria and yeast, strained into something soft and sour. The samples came from 3 tombs at Xiaohe. They are, as far as anyone can currently establish, the oldest cheese ever recovered anywhere on Earth. Fu described the physical state of it plainly. Regular cheese is soft. This was not. 3,500 years in a salt desert had turned it dry and dense and hard. The genetic work went further than identification. The team recovered animal DNA from the samples and found goat and cow. Then they sequenced the microbes. 2 species came back, Lactobacillus kefir and Lactobacillus helveticus, and both of them are still in the kefir people make and drink today. The organisms sitting on that woman's throat are the working ancestors of a product currently sold in supermarkets. Then comes the detail that reframes the whole thing. The Xiaohe people were lactose intolerant. Their genomes carry no adaptation for digesting milk sugar into adulthood. They were dairy pastoralists, as their own dental plaque had already proved, living in a place where herds were one of the few reliable sources of food, and their bodies could not process the milk those herds produced. Fermentation solves that. The bacteria consume the lactose. What comes out the other side is a food a lactose-intolerant population can eat without consequence. These people had a biological problem, and they had a technical answer to it, and they were using that answer 3,500 years ago in a desert basin. The root matters more than the recipe. Kefir has generally been understood to have spread out of the northern Caucasus, moving west into Europe and outward from there. The strains recovered at Xiaohe do not fit that single path. When the team compared the ancient Lactobacillus kefir against its modern relatives, the family tree split into 2 branches, indicating a second and separate spread of the culture into inland Asia. And the Xiaohe strain sits closely related to strains found in Tibet. That is a specific, traceable, physical connection between the Tarim Basin and a region on the other side of a mountain system, running through a living organism rather than through a pot or a bead. Kefir cannot be reinvented from scratch by accident. The culture has to be handed over. Someone gave it to them, or they gave it to someone, and either direction requires contact. Why it was placed on the bodies, nobody knows. One reading offered is that it was provision for the dead, a valued food sent along for whatever came next. That is an interpretation reconstructed from context and from what burial goods usually mean elsewhere, and it is not something the Xiaohe people left behind any means of confirming. What can be stated plainly is that the placement was deliberate and it was repeated. Multiple tombs, arranged on the throat and around the head, not dropped in the fill. Somebody decided this belonged on the body, and other people kept deciding it. And that sits awkwardly against the verdict of 2021. The genomes had said these people admitted no one. Sealed. A genetic island. But an island does not receive a live bacterial culture from a distant highland by chance. Wheat and millet can travel through a dozen intermediaries. A kefir starter is harder. It has to stay alive, which means it has to move at the speed of people carrying it. The cheese pointed outward. 4 years after the verdict, so did the genomes. In July of 2025, in the journal Current Biology, a paper appeared under the title, Bronze and Iron Age Genomes Reveal the Integration of Diverse Ancestries in the Tarim Basin. The lead author was Fan Zhang, working again with Yinqiu Cui, along with Shiju Gao, Shui Zhao, and Chao Ning. Fan Zhang had led the 2021 Nature paper. The scientist who established the isolation was now the scientist complicating it. The scope is the whole story here, so it is worth stating carefully what the earlier study had actually sampled. 13 individuals, essentially one horizon at one site, in the eastern part of the basin. Vakish Narasimhan had flagged the risk at the time, noting that wider sampling could reveal connections the first 13 genomes had no way of showing. It was a limitation the original authors acknowledged, and a caution the coverage largely ignored, because a clean answer travels better than a caveat. The new study reported 24 genomes from the Western Tarim Basin, spanning the Bronze Age into the Iron Age, a different corner of the same desert. And the answer from that corner was not isolation. The Bronze Age individuals from the Western Tarim derived most of their ancestry from steppe pastoralists, tracing back to the rapid eastward expansion of Androvovo-related cultures out of the Western steppe. Not a trace signal. The majority of their ancestry. The migration that the eastern cemeteries had shown no sign of whatsoever had come into the basin from the other side. The sequence the team reconstructed is layered. As those steppe groups moved east, they first mixed with agricultural populations related to the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, the same Central Asian oasis civilization that had been proposed decades earlier as a homeland, and then discarded. Only afterward did they mix with the indigenous groups represented by the Tarim mummies. 2 of the 3 original theories turned out to describe real people. They had simply been describing the wrong part of the basin. There was more. Many of these individuals were genetically distinct from the Andronovo-related groups already documented in western Xinjiang, which indicates that at least 2 separate waves brought steppe populations into the region rather than one. And then the single most striking result in the paper. One Iron Age individual from the Western Tarim shows almost no steppe influence at all. That person appears to descend instead from a direct mixture between BMAC-related populations and the indigenous ancestors of the Tarim, a pairing nobody had previously identified. In a landscape that steppe ancestry had largely reshaped, someone was still walking around 1,000 years later carrying a combination that had bypassed it entirely. The author's conclusion was that the Iron Age Tarim was genetically heterogeneous, and that an indigenous legacy endured there for more than 1,000 years. Now, it is important to be exact about what this does and does not overturn, because the temptation is to swing too far. The 2021 finding still stands. The founders buried at Xiaohe were locally descended, they carried no Western steppe ancestry, and their lineage ran back to the ancient North Eurasians. Nothing in the new work contradicts any of that. What collapses is the sentence everyone actually took away. The Tarim Basin was isolated. That was never what the data supported. 13 people from one cemetery were isolated. The basin is a landmass roughly the size of Germany, and the eastern cemeteries and the western cemeteries turn out to record 2 different worlds, separated by distance and by several centuries. The genetic island was real. It was simply much smaller than the map it got drawn onto. This is how the field is supposed to work, and it is worth saying so directly, because the honest version is less satisfying than the clean one. A finding gets published. It is accurate within its sampling. The sampling is narrow, and the conclusion drawn from it in public is wider than the evidence allows. Then somebody goes and digs in a different place. The isolation was narrower than anyone assumed. It also, as it turned out, did not hold. Start with the wider picture. In March of 2022, in the journal Science, a team led by Vikas Kumar with Wenjun Wang, Andrew Bennett, and Qiaomei Fu published genome-wide data for 201 ancient individuals from 39 archaeological sites across Xinjiang. It remains the broadest single survey of the region ever attempted. What that survey found was that Bronze Age Xinjiang populations were built from 4 major ancestries: related to early Bronze Age cultures of the Central and Eastern Steppe, to Central Asia, and to the Tarim Basin itself. Read that last item again. The Tarim component is not sitting off to one side as a curiosity. It is one of the founding ingredients of the entire region. Then, in March of 2026, in molecular biology and evolution, a team led by Xiaomin Yang, Xinyue Zhu, and Haijun Li, working with Chuanchao Wang at Fudan University, published genomes from 23 individuals across 12 sites in the eastern Tian Shan. That range sits well outside the basin, on the corridor that links Xinjiang to northern China. The Tarim ancestry was there. In Iron Age populations of the eastern Tian Shan, it appears at roughly 5 to 31%, depending on the group. And it does not stop at the Iron Age. In historical era individuals from the Astana and Qinvifen cemeteries, it is still present, at roughly 7 to 26%, thousands of years after the founders were laid in their boat-shaped coffins. The author's reading is that this ancestry dispersed outward from the Tarim Basin and reached the eastern Tian Shan. And it goes further still. A separate study published by Dai and colleagues in the same journal in 2022 examined modern Central Asian populations and found Tarim-related ancestry surviving in living people, with Highland Tajik groups in particular carrying gene flow from this source. So here is what the record now says, stated once and stated plainly. A population that borrowed from every direction and married no one held that pattern for centuries. Then it stopped holding. Their ancestry crossed a mountain range they had not crossed, spread east along a corridor toward China, persisted through the Iron Age, survived into the historical period under Han and Tang administration, and can still be measured in people alive today. Isolation was a phase. It was never an identity. But the answer does not close every question, and it is worth being honest about what remains open. The matter of language is unresolved. Whether these people spoke an early form of Tocharian, the extinct Indo-European tongue later attested in the basin, cannot be established from ancestry. Elizabeth Wayland Barber has cautioned against assuming it, pointing to the long gap between the mummies and the first surviving texts, more than enough time for a language to arrive without the people changing. Ronald Kim has argued the timing could still fit. The evidence sits between them, and it is not this account's place to force it one way. The limits of scope have not gone away either. The 2026 Tian Shan study states its own constraint openly. Most of its sites are represented by one or two individuals, spanning different periods and different micro-regions, and the authors describe their conclusions as limited interpretations pending denser sampling. That is the same caution that was raised about the original 13 genomes, and it is being raised now by the people whose work is doing the correcting. Access remains a constraint. The political sensitivity of the region and the restrictions on foreign research mean the record here is far from fully read. And one thing should be said directly. None of this genetic evidence establishes any modern claim to the region by anyone. Ancestry is not title. The archaeology and the present-day dispute are separate questions, and treating a genome as a deed is a category error regardless of who is doing it. What can be said is that a century of assumptions collapsed once in 2021, and then the replacement collapsed too, and the thing that finally broke it open was a lump of dried cheese on a woman's throat. Return to tomb 25 and to the woman inside it. She has been read 3 separate ways. First as a stranger who wandered in from somewhere far to the west. Then as her exact opposite, a survivor of a vanished Ice Age lineage who had never gone anywhere and never let anyone in. And now as something harder to summarize than either. A woman in woolen fur in a place that should have killed her, eating a food her own body could not otherwise digest, made with a living culture whose root across a continent is still traceable in the bacteria on her skin, carrying ancestry that would one day cross a mountain range she never crossed and surface in people walking around today. She was never a mystery of arrival. She was a record of contact, written in a substance nobody could read for 21 years. The desert has not finished handing them over.